History said Custer was a hero. But there was a 12-year-old boy standing on the battlefield that day, and what he saw shattered everything the white man's history ever told you. This is the story they buried. The story of Black Elk, the boy who watched an empire lie. The witness the world forgot, the true story of Black Elk and Custer's last stand. The boy born into thunder. The Great Plains, December 1863. In the winter that the Lakota people counted as the winter when the 4 Crows were killed on Tongue River, a child entered the world along the banks of the Little Powder River, in what would one day become the state of Wyoming. He was the 4th man in his family to carry the name Black Elk, Hehakasapa, and from the very moment of his birth, those who knew the signs said the spirit world was watching closely. The Great Plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast ocean of grass and sky, alive with the thunder of millions of buffalo hooves, the cry of eagles, and the ancient songs of a people who had lived in sacred harmony with this land for countless generations. The Oglala Lakota were a proud and powerful nation. They were hunters, warriors, healers, and dreamers. They were the children of the land itself. Black Elk's family was a family of medicine men. His father was a healer. His uncles were healers. And so from his first breath, the boy was soaked in the wisdom of visions and the sacred language of the spirit world. But the world into which Black Elk was born was already trembling. Far to the east, the white settlers, whom the Lakota called the Wasichus, were multiplying like the grasses of spring. Their roads cut through sacred hunting grounds. Their iron horses breathed smoke across the prairie. And their government was making promises that it had no intention of keeping. Still, in those early years of his childhood, Black Elk knew joy. He knew the warmth of a teepee on a winter night. He knew the exhilaration of running bare-legged through spring grass. He knew the deep belonging of being surrounded by his people, his language, his songs. But the thunder was coming. And it would arrive sooner than anyone knew. The Great Vision. Age 9, summer, 1872. When Black Elk was 9 years old, he fell desperately ill. 4 days, he lay motionless in the teepee, his eyes closed, his body still as stone. His family feared he was dying. His mother wept. His father prayed. But inside that stillness, something extraordinary was happening. Black Elk was not dying. He was traveling. He later described what came to him, a vision so vast, so terrifying, and so sacred that it would define every single day of the rest of his 86-year life. He was carried upward by horses of every color, black, white, sorrel, and buckskin. He entered a great cloud and found himself before a council of 6 grandfathers, ancient, wise beings who represented the 4 directions, the sky, and the earth. They gave him powers. They gave him a cup of water, the power of life. They gave him a bow, the power of destruction. They gave him a bright red stick, the tree of life. They showed him the hoop of his people, strong and whole. And then they showed him something else. They showed him the hoop breaking. They showed him a great darkness descending on the people. They showed him the sacred tree dying, its branches bare. They showed him his nation scattered like dust. But then, at the very end, they showed him the tree blooming again. They showed him the hoop restored. They showed him light returning to the world. When Black Elk finally opened his eyes and returned to the living, he told no one of this vision for 8 years. It was too enormous. Too sacred. Too terrifying. He carried it alone, a 9-year-old boy walking the earth with the weight of an entire nation's fate on his small shoulders. The world cracks open. The Black Hills, 1874. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the sacred Black Hills of South Dakota, the Pahasapa, land guaranteed forever to the Lakota people by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. Custer's scouts found something that would change everything: gold. Word spread across America like wildfire. Gold in the Black Hills. Fortune hunters, miners, and settlers flooded into sacred Lakota territory. The U.S. government, rather than honoring its treaty and removing the trespassers, began pressuring the Lakota to sell their most sacred land. The Lakota refused. Tensions rose through 1875. The Great Sitting Bull, visionary leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, called the nations together. Warriors came from across the plains. Crazy Horse, the most brilliant military mind the Lakota had ever produced, rode at the head of the Oglala warriors. Thousands of people gathered in the valley of the Greasy Grass, the river the white man called the Little Bighorn, determined to live free on their own land. On December 6, 1875, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum: all Lakota must report to reservations by January 31, 1876. Those who did not comply would be considered hostile. The deadline was impossible. It was the dead of winter, and many people simply could not travel. But the government declared them hostile anyway. The army was mobilized. War was now inevitable. And in the great encampment along the Little Bighorn River, 12-year-old Black Elk sharpened his knife, readied his bow, and prepared for what was coming. The day the earth shook. June 25, 1876, the Battle of the Greasy Grass. The morning of June 25, 1876 began like any other. The massive village, thousands of people spread along the river, was alive with the sounds of children playing, women cooking, horses grazing. No one knew that miles away, a column of cavalry was already riding toward them. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, Long Hair as the Lakota called him, had divided his 7th Cavalry Regiment into 3 groups. He had been warned by his own Crow scouts that the village was enormous, the largest native encampment any of them had ever seen. He was told there were thousands of warriors. He was told to wait for reinforcements. Custer ignored every warning. Perhaps it was ambition. Perhaps it was arrogance. Perhaps it was the intoxicating mythology of his own invincibility that had been built up by years of newspaper headlines calling him a hero. Whatever the reason, Custer made the decision that would seal his fate, and the fate of every man riding with him. He attacked. Black Elk was in the village when the alarm went up. He heard the cry. Soldiers were coming from the south, from the direction of Major Reno's advancing column. Warriors grabbed their weapons and streamed out to meet the attack. The ground shook with thousands of hooves. The air filled with war cries, gunshots, and the screaming of horses. Reno's men pushed into the valley, but what they found was not a defenseless camp full of frightened families. What they found was a wall of Lakota warriors, mounted and armed, pouring out of the village like a tide. Reno's charge stalled. Then it broke. His men turned and fled back across the river, scrambling up the bluffs on the eastern bank in terror and confusion. Meanwhile, Custer had ridden north along the ridgelines, looking for a way to strike the northern end of the village. His Crow scouts, seeing what lay ahead, began changing back into their native clothing. They knew what was about to happen. Custer released them. Black Elk heard the guns shifting to the north. He grabbed his bow and joined the warriors flooding toward the sound of battle. What he witnessed in the next hours would haunt him for the rest of his life. Crazy Horse did not charge headlong into Custer's guns. He was far too brilliant for that. He looped wide, sweeping around the northern flank, cutting off any route of escape. The warriors pressed from every direction, from the river, from the ridges, from the draws and gullies. Custer's 210 men found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and with nowhere to run. The dust rose so thick it blocked the sun. The noise was beyond anything the human mind could process. Black Elk, 12 years old, armed with a bow, rode through the chaos, the sounds of dying men all around him. He came upon a soldier who lay wounded on the ground, still alive. A warrior called out to him, "Boy, get off and take his scalp." Black Elk dismounted. He started. The soldier ground his teeth. Black Elk shot him and took the scalp. Then, as any 12-year-old might do, he rode home to show his mother. By the time the sun was low in the sky, it was over. George Armstrong Custer and every single one of his 210 men were dead. Not one soldier in Custer's immediate command survived. The battle had lasted perhaps an hour. But this was not the glorious last stand that American newspapers would soon invent. There was no circle of soldiers heroically fighting to the last bullet. Archaeological evidence and multiple Native American eyewitnesses tell a different story, one of panic, confusion, men fleeing downhill toward the river, companies breaking apart and dying in scattered groups across the ridges. The lie of Custer's heroic last stand was already being written, even before the bodies were cold. The aftermath and the lie. July 1876, Washington, D.C. and beyond. When news of the battle reached the eastern United States, the country erupted in outrage. It was July 4th weekend, the centennial of American independence, and the United States had just suffered its most humiliating military defeat at the hands of the Native Americans they had been calling savages. The newspapers needed a hero. They needed a story. And so they built one. George Armstrong Custer was transformed overnight into a martyred legend. Paintings depicted him standing at the center of a desperate circle, his yellow hair flowing, saber raised, fighting heroically to the very last breath. The brave and noble cavalry, the story went, cut down by overwhelming savage numbers. The reality was erased. The fact that Custer had been warned and ignored those warnings, erased. The fact that the Lakota were fighting on their own treaty-protected land, erased. The fact that men in Custer's command panicked and were shot fleeing downhill, erased. The fact that Reno and Benteen, hearing the guns, failed to come to Custer's aid, quietly minimized. And the Native American accounts? The voices of the actual eyewitnesses, of warriors like Crazy Horse, of chiefs like Sitting Bull, of young fighters like the 12-year-old Black Elk? Buried. Dismissed. Disbelieved. The government used the outrage over Custer's defeat to accelerate its war against the free nations of the plains. Within months, thousands of soldiers flooded the region. One by one, the great leaders were hunted down. Crazy Horse, the undefeated warrior, surrendered at Fort Robinson in May 1877. He was promised protection and peaceful reservation life. Instead, just months later, he was bayoneted by a soldier during an engineered confrontation. He died that night. Sitting Bull fled to Canada and held out for 4 years before finally returning to surrender in 1881. He would be shot dead 9 years later by tribal policemen on his own reservation. The free life of the plains was ending. And Black Elk was watching every moment of it. The Great Tree Falls. Pine Ridge Reservation, 1877 to 1886. Black Elk returned with his people to the land that was being carved up around them. The great buffalo herds, upon which the entire culture and survival of the Plains nations depended, were being systematically slaughtered by the millions. White hunters with rifles were shooting them for sport and for hides, leaving mountains of bones rotting on the plains. It was not an accident. It was policy. Without the buffalo, the Lakota could not survive outside the reservations. By the time Black Elk was a young man in his late teens and early 20s, the world of his childhood had been replaced by something unrecognizable. The Lakota were penned onto the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, hungry, diseased, and stripped of their language, their ceremonies, their way of life. At 17, Black Elk finally told the medicine man about his great childhood vision. The man listened. And when Black Elk finished, the old man sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "Boy, I know what the vision was telling you. Now you must perform it for the people. That is why the grandfathers gave it to you." Black Elk began his life as a healer. He learned the sacred ceremonies. He learned the medicines of the earth. He developed a reputation among his people as someone with real power, a man through whom the spirit world could work. People came to him sick and left healed. He saw into things that others could not see. But the reservation was slowly strangling his people's spirit. And Black Elk began to wonder if there was something else out there, something beyond the horizon, that might hold answers. The world beyond the horizon. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, 1886 to 1889. In 1886, at the age of 22, Black Elk made a decision that would change his life forever. He joined Buffalo Bill Cody's famous Wild West Show. It was a strange and complicated choice. The show was, in many ways, a performance of Native American defeat, warriors in war paint playing the role of the conquered for the entertainment of white audiences. And yet Black Elk saw it differently. He wanted to understand the Wasichus. He wanted to see their world with his own eyes. He wanted to understand the source of their power, the thing that had overwhelmed his people. He performed in cities across the eastern United States. He rode into Madison Square Garden. He performed for Queen Victoria of England herself, Grandmother England, the Lakota called her, at her Golden Jubilee in 1887. He traveled through France, Germany, and Italy. In Paris, he fell in love. He learned to speak rudimentary English. He observed the white world with the careful eyes of a man who was simultaneously a guest, a performer, a prisoner, and a student. And what he saw both amazed and broke his heart. The sheer scale of the Wasichu world, their cities, their factories, their millions of people, made him understand why his nation had been overwhelmed. It was not weakness. It was not because the Great Spirit had abandoned the Lakota. It was simply numbers and metal and greed on a scale that no amount of bravery or spiritual power could counter. He also saw the hollowness at the center of it all. The white people were rich and powerful, but they seemed, to Black Elk's eyes, deeply lost. They had more things than any people should ever need, and yet their faces showed a haunting emptiness. They had mastered the earth but forgotten the sky. In the spring of 1888, Black Elk became separated from the Wild West Company and was stranded in Europe for nearly a year. He eventually made his way back to Pine Ridge in the autumn of 1889. What he found there shattered him. The Ghost Dance. Pine Ridge Reservation, 1889 to 1890. The reservation he returned to was worse than anything he had left. The U.S. Congress had just passed an act reducing the already tiny Great Sioux Reservation by half. People were starving. Disease was rampant. Children were being taken from families and sent to government boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their religion. The old ways were being systematically destroyed. And then word came of a prophet. His name was Wovoka, a Paiute spiritual leader from Nevada, and his message was electrifying. If the people danced the ghost dance, the white men would disappear, the buffalo would return, and the dead ancestors would come back to walk among the living. The world would be restored. Black Elk heard this message and felt something stir deep in his chest, something connected to the great vision he had been given as a 9-year-old boy. He traveled to see the ghost dance for himself. He participated. He experienced visions. He received a special ghost dance shirt and brought the ceremony back to his people. The ghost dance swept across the Lakota nation like wildfire. People danced for hours, 4 days, falling into trances, weeping, calling out the names of their dead. It was desperate. It was beautiful. It was the last flower growing in scorched earth. The white settlers and government agents watching from the edges of the reservation were terrified. They did not understand what they were seeing. They saw thousands of Native Americans in ceremonial dress, dancing and chanting, and they heard only one thing: war. Reports went back to Washington. The army was mobilized. Troops poured onto the reservation. And on December 15, 1890, Sitting Bull, the great visionary chief, was assassinated by tribal policemen on his own reservation. Shot in the back of the head. The man who had never been defeated in battle, who had survived Custer's attack, who had held out in Canada for 4 years, killed on the land that was supposed to be his sanctuary. 2 weeks later, the nightmare reached its final, unspeakable act. Wounded Knee. December 29, 1890. Bigfoot's band of Miniconjou Lakota, hungry, cold, and terrified, were traveling to Pine Ridge to seek safety. Many of them were sick. Bigfoot himself was ill with pneumonia. They were surrounded by the 7th Cavalry, the same regiment, rebuilt, that had followed Custer into the Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. On the morning of December 29, 1890, at a place called Wounded Knee Creek, the army attempted to disarm the Lakota. No one knows exactly who fired the first shot. Perhaps it was a deaf warrior named Black Coyote who didn't understand the order. Perhaps it was an accident. Perhaps it was something more deliberate. What is certain is what happened next. The Army's 4 Hotchkiss rapid-fire guns, positioned on the surrounding hillsides, opened up on the encampment. In minutes, hundreds of Lakota lay dead or dying in the snow. Women and children were pursued across the fields and shot. Bodies were found miles away, people who had fled desperately before being cut down. At least 250 Lakota died that day. Some estimates say more. The soldiers suffered 25 casualties, most from their own crossfire. Black Elk arrived after the massacre was already over. He rode into the silence that followed. The sun was still shining. The sky was still blue. And across the snow-covered valley of Wounded Knee Creek, the bodies of his people lay scattered, women, children, old men, frozen in the positions in which they had fallen. He charged with a small group of warriors, briefly entering the fire. A bullet grazed his hip. He fought until the great Lakota chief Red Cloud came to him and said, "It is over. Stop fighting. There is no future in it now." Black Elk put down his weapons. Later, he described looking out over the frozen bodies at Wounded Knee and feeling something that no language could fully hold. "I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud, and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream." The Long Winter. Pine Ridge Reservation, 1891 to 1930. After Wounded Knee, the organized military resistance of the Plains Nations was broken forever. Black Elk settled into life on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the same land, the same sky, but a world utterly transformed. In 1904, following the death of his first wife, Black Elk converted to Roman Catholicism and took the baptismal name Nicholas. It was a decision that confused many of his people and has been debated by scholars ever since. Was it genuine faith? Was it strategic survival? Was it both? The truth, as Black Elk lived it, seems to have been more complex and human than any single answer. He practiced both worlds, the Catholic catechist teaching the faith of the newcomers, and the medicine man quietly tending the sacred fires of the old ways. His children, he said, had to live in this world. He was a man bridging an impossible divide, carrying both the old light and the new. He healed the sick. He taught. He prayed. He waited. And somewhere deep inside him, the great vision of the 9-year-old boy still burned. The grandfathers had shown him the hoop broken and the hoop restored. He had seen the broken hoop with his own eyes. He was still waiting for the restoration. Years passed. Decades passed. The reservation remained poor, hungry, and forgotten. And then, in the autumn of 1930, a poet arrived. The Poet and the Holy Man. Pine Ridge Reservation, 1930. His name was John G. Neihardt, a Nebraska poet and writer who had come to Pine Ridge to research a book about the ghost dance movement. He expected an interview. What he got was something far larger. Black Elk was 67 years old when Neihardt arrived at his door. He had been carrying his great vision for 58 years. He had watched his world destroyed and his people broken. He had fought at Little Bighorn. He had survived Wounded Knee. He had danced with Buffalo Bill before Queen Victoria. He had stood at the edge of the world and looked into the abyss. And he had never, in all those years, found anyone he trusted enough to receive the full weight of what he had been carrying. Until now. Something in Neihardt's face, in his eyes, in the particular quality of his listening, moved Black Elk. He told the poet to come back in the spring. Neihardt returned in 1931 with his daughters to record the conversations. Black Elk spoke, and his son Ben translated, and Neihardt's daughter Enid wrote it all down. 4 days, the holy man poured out the story of his life, the vision, the battles, the losses, the years of silence. He wept. He prayed. He performed sacred rituals in Neihardt's honor. He shared things he had never shared with any living person. When it was over, Black Elk said to Neihardt, "I know now that the tree has never died. A man who has a vision is not able to use the power of it until after he has performed the vision on earth for the people to see." In 1932, the book was published, Black Elk Speaks. For 30 years, it was largely ignored, a quiet, strange, beautiful book sitting on library shelves, read by a few poets and scholars and spiritual seekers. And then, in the 1960s and 1970s, something changed. The civil rights movement, the American Indian movement, the hunger of a generation searching for a different kind of truth, all of it converged on this extraordinary book. Black Elk Speaks became one of the most widely read books in history by a Native American author. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It is taught in universities around the world. The German translation alone has sold millions of copies. The voice that history tried to bury had refused to be silenced. The Last Days. Pine Ridge, 1941 to 1950. Black Elk's second wife, Anna Brings White, died in 1941. His children were grown. His grandson Benjamin Black Elk would become famous as the fifth face of Mount Rushmore, posing for photographs at the memorial throughout the 1950s, the face of the Lakota people standing in the shadow of the presidents carved from stone. Black Elk himself lived quietly at Pine Ridge, old now, nearly blind, and thin. But the fire behind his eyes never went out. Visitors came from around the world, drawn by the book, by the vision, by something they couldn't quite name but desperately needed. In 1947, he spoke again, this time to the American ethnologist Joseph Epes Brown, and dictated the 7 sacred ceremonies of the Oglala Lakota, preserved in the book The Sacred Pipe. In his final months, his daughter Lucy asked him what he truly believed. He thought for a long time. And then he said, "The only thing I really believe is the pipe religion." On August 19, 1950, Black Elk died on the Pine Ridge Reservation. He was 86 years old. He had been born into a world of open prairies and free nations. He died in a world of fences and poverty and broken promises. He had seen it all, from both sides, from the inside, from the ground where the blood soaked into the earth. He was buried quietly. There was no grand ceremony. No national mourning. No recognition from the government whose army had ridden against his people. But the book remained. The vision remained. The hoop, cracked and battered, was still turning. The truth that could not be buried. History wrote the Battle of Little Bighorn as a story of savage defeat, of a brave white soldier overwhelmed by hordes of violent warriors. Museums displayed paintings of Custer's heroic last stand. Schools taught children that the U.S. Army brought civilization to the West. But Black Elk was there. 12 years old, on horseback, in the smoke and thunder of the Greasy Grass Valley. And what he saw was not savagery. What he saw was a people defending their home, their families, and their sacred land, promised to them by treaty, against an army that had come to take it. The truth is that Custer's last stand was built on a foundation of broken promises, gold fever, and imperial greed. The Lakota and Cheyenne did not attack the United States. The United States attacked them, on their own land, in violation of its own treaty. Custer was not a hero. He was a reckless commander who ignored every warning and led 210 men to their deaths out of ambition and arrogance. And the real last stand at Little Bighorn was not Custer's. It was the Lakotas. It was the last time a free nation of the American plains would ever stand fully upright on the earth that had given them birth. What came after, the reservations, the starvation, the massacres, the forced schooling, the the systematic destruction of culture and language and spiritual life, that was the true horror of those years. Not Custer's death, but the death of a world. Black Elk lived long enough to tell the story. Long enough to ensure that the grandfather's vision did not die completely in the blizzard at Wounded Knee. Long enough to hand the sacred pipe to a world that was just beginning, slowly, painfully, to learn how to listen. He was the boy the history books forgot. He was the witness who refused to disappear. And the tree, the sacred tree of his great childhood vision, is still growing.